Linear perspective is a scientific method, and again, it helps us determine placement, forms in space, helps us plot out points, lines, and planes, and it also shows how they diminish or compress. Look at this image here by Paulo Uccello, and this is from the early 1400s. Even back then, you can see here that artists are really kind of pushing this idea of three-dimensionality. How do they get realism in their forms? And that comes by the use of this classic Renaissance technique called linear perspective. Now, the system was established by Italian artists during the Renaissance, and it was really used to help solve complex spatial problems as artists began to look for ways to describe the world more realistically. One-point perspectives kind of created a hierarchical view that can be really reviewed from one point. We saw that in some previous works where we saw the Madonna on the pedestal, and there were some size issues there as well. Here we can see in this study done by Albert Dürer, and he's a high artist from the Renaissance in Germany, and you can see that he's actually using a scientific system. And if you look at the study of if you look at the study of St. Jerome in his study, notice that all these lines, the windows of the lattice of the window, the beams in the ceiling, the base of the columns, they all constrain to what we call one-point perspective. They all have a common vanishing point that goes off into the distance. And this is a great scientific system, and artists really kind of sought out a system that crafted a measurable space, but also one that created a kind of a unified image. Because before that, artists had a very kind of rudimentary understanding of perspective, and they didn't know how to unify the space by creating one or 2-point perspectives that were consistent for the other objects. So basically, prior works were done with observation that were really only approximations of the forms as they align themselves in that space. So what I want to kind of show to you is that perspective is a method that any of you can apply. And you may want to do this in some of your illustrative work in the class when we're doing the t-shirt design. It depends on what you come up with. Now here we see a more contemporary example. This is artist Richard Estes. And this style of art is called photorealism because he used a photograph as his reference for his painting. This is actually a painting. And this is also kind of an idea that the invention of the camera verified that perspective was a valid system for measuring, as well as being an objective way to represent forms or objects as they advance or diminish in space. The photographer's lens imitated previous devices that were used to understand perspective. If you're in my digital photo class, you've learned a little bit about this. It's called that camera obscura principle or pinhole camera. Some of you may have done this in grade school for an eclipse. But within the context of a one-point perspective, there's a sense of a fixed position of the artist that is doing all the artwork from a current fixed point. So basically, when you work with perspective, you try not to move as much because, again, you're relying on your power of observation as well as sighting, which we're going to take a look at later on this week. Now, contemporary artists like Edward Hopper, they don't always lay out their drawings with a ruler, a T-square, or a triangle. However, Hopper's clearly aware of the structural system of perspective, and he's using that along with his observations. And an artist with a well-trained eye will compare relative size and angles, and understanding perspective helps artists use convergence and things that diminish. It shows how that form moves back and forth between vanishing points. And you can kind of see that here in Hopper's image. He's got kind of a one-point perspective that ends right here. We can see that from the walkway, the roof edge of the building, the pedestal for the pumps, even the top of the pumps, all come down to this one point. So when you use a system of perspective, whether it be 1 point or 2 point, it presents a very consistent, pleasing, convincing image to the eye because you're constraining everything to this rule of linear perspective. Now this image, I call this kind of naive. What's kind of missing in terms of perspective, it feels like there's no depth. The sidewalk and the driveway, look like cutout rectangles. You can't really distinguish the roof of the house in the foreground. The roofs in the top, there's really no kind of vanishing. Everything is parallel to one another as far as the roof lines. So it's really not that convincing. So I call that kind of naive. Now, when we look at artwork, we have to kind of consider the artists because sometimes artists do this on purpose to really kind of tweak our perceptions. You can look here, this is kind of a creative copy by David Hockney, a 1980s artist. And you can see here in his version on the left, he's kind of updated William Hogarth's kind of playful print. And in both versions of this image, it's kind of showing how both these artists are turning the pictorial space in and out. You can kind of see those kind of spatial characteristics happening here as this lady leans out the upper second story of this building and lights the pipe for this guy that's way back off in the hills in the distance. His scale, if we're to believe it, would make him a giant. Okay, so lots of different stuff going on in these kind of images. Very interesting kind of artwork. Other artists, you might go, well, why do we even need to know this, Jefferson? What's important about studying a 500-year-old system of perspective today? We have cameras, we have computers. Well, in all honesty, you need a system to check your work and to understand space. And we see that happening today with painters. And there's really a renewed movement in painters. And this is a work by Paul Winstanley. I actually got a chance to see this at MoCA probably about 4 years ago now. And this is a beautiful oil painting. He is yet another photorealist painter. And this is a relatively big piece, 4 foot by about 3 foot. And when we look at work like this, people continue to enjoy painting and drawing for many different reasons. Sometimes it's that brilliance and beauty of the color and the large-scale imagery, and sometimes it's the content, point of view, or the way that the artist sees the world. Realism is accessible and a great means to represent the world we share. You do that every day with your phones. Snapchat, TikTok, taking pictures, Instagram, all that stuff, Pinterest. So all that represents the world. And when we think about the way we interact in the world and start to kind of create kind of objects or two-dimensional things in this class, knowing perspective is very helpful. I find it helpful when I'm retouching images in Photoshop. If I'm going in and having to tweak perspective because the lens gave some distortion or the camera added 10 pounds. Here you can see like Paul Winstanley. He comes from an entirely different generation, and his work really kind of engages with kind of photography and video and kind of almost kind of deliberately kind of confuses the origins of painting. He's kind of playing with the mimesis and the meditation. So his art is really kind of an interesting twist to the roles of a photorealist painter. And he's very fastidious, and his work is just, when you see it, you can't really believe that it's a painting. You have to get right up on it. And then we had artists like Cezanne, Braque, and Picasso. These guys sought to deconstruct primarily the power of Western painting. This is in the early 1900s. And these artists challenged that a fixed point of view, they argued that a fixed point of view was like seeing a being in multiple perspectives, that viewing is cumulative, that as you and I walk through space and we view an object, we see, frames and frames and frames of it and different representations of it. And because of time and space, it almost ends up kind of being like a double exposure. And because the body moves, the perceptive space constantly changes. And they kind of sought to really kind of represent this idea visually with kind of the Cubist movement, among others. Here's work that you've probably seen. When I was a kid, you could go to the mall when we had indoor malls, and you could go to a Prints Plus, which was a poster place that had every conceivable poster, thousands of posters, and you can get them framed up to hang on your bedroom wall. M.C. Escher was a very popular artist, and he really created a very imaginary world. And he's kind of showing us his knowledge of how to employ and tweak perspective, and it really gives his image a surreal feeling, yet somewhat feeling plausible. He creates this kind of abstract, plausible reality. Look, as we have stairs going up, stairs underneath, going up, down, the space becomes very distorted, almost kind of like a fun house, so to speak. And then we have artists like Wayne Thiebaud, and we see art like this, and here Thiebaud is really kind of exaggerating the perspective and scale of a San Francisco hill or a street. He's really exaggerated to recreate this feeling of driving up what seems like an endless hill. And if you've ever been in San Francisco, there are some really steep hills. And if you drive a stick shift, oh my gosh, So next time you if you go to the sea, pay attention to that. But here the artist is really kind of heightening that kind of, or emphasizing that kind of vertical kind of takeoff almost of this never-ending street. And then we have kind of surreal, kind of abstract artists. This is Kelly McLean, and Kelly McLean is a Los Angeles-based artist and really uses linear perspective with semi-realistic renderings of graphite and washes of color that lead us into this kind of surreal world. It really looks like an imaginary landscape filled with strange events. I mean, there's like a fence here, here's a dog, another dog. There's these trees in the background, but then the scale of this horse right here versus the trees is very unsettling. It doesn't look correct to us. And then these bushes and trees down in the lower left have this very abstract form. They almost metamorphosize into kind of other objects. So very, very abstract artists. I'll show you more of McLean's work here later. Now, when we start to think about perspective, it is all relative. And when we talk about perspective for creating artwork or sketching from real life, artists, meaning you observe from a fixed viewpoint. And your viewpoint has a limited range of view or a cone of vision. And that's about 60 to 80 degrees. And interestingly enough, a 50 millimeter lens for a DSLR or 35 millimeter camera is considered a 50 to 55 millimeter because that replicates relatively closely the angle of vision of the human eyes. So those images taken with that lens focal length look pleasing and natural because it replicates what we see. Now, when we're thinking about making perspective drawings, it can be kind of intimidating. There's some really basic things. It's helpful to align your head parallel to the ground plane. It's helpful to pay attention that objects in front appear larger and those in back diminish in space. Now here you can see I have an example, again, student using a viewfinder, and you're using that viewfinder to create a picture plane. It's like your imaginary rectangle. It's like a window, and it's parallel to your eyes. It intersects your cone of vision and crops out an image so that you can find a composition that's dynamic and active. Kind of like a plate of glass or looking out your bedroom window. Crops out what you can't see on either side. The picture plane represents a specific point of view, and it helps us how to understand how to flatten out that space. And again, that's why I want to encourage you guys to continue to use those viewfinders. Now, it's important to understand the principles that led up to perspective. Artists back in the day, they understood how desirable a fixed point of view was. And they used this in order to recreate a sense of deep space in two dimensions, meaning on a piece of paper. Now, this is a good example of a drawing device that they would use. So this drawing device has a fixed viewpoint. The artist would look through the frame, which maps a grid onto a piece of paper that would be down below in front of him. And so right here, the artist would place his chin and his left or right eye, whichever is his dominant eye, in line with this point, so that as he looked down through this frame, which typically had a grid of wire, kind of like graph paper stretched between here, he would look down through that, and by consistently placing his head and viewpoint at the same point, he can make a very convincing, realistic space. Here's a side view of kind of a more basic kind of setup, and you can see that grid breaks up the image into equal kind of units or square. And this was made with wire and wood frame. And really what the artist does, he copies the relative size and position of the shapes in the square. It's almost like scanning an image, kind of like breaking a complex image into smaller parts like pixels, essentially. And this is what this device looked like from the side. So we can see here's that fixed point that the artist constantly puts his gaze at. We can see here there's the frame with the grid, and notice down here his paper has that grid as well. So when we see it from this side view, we can see how it's laid out. We can see that the model's reclining. But then when we look at his viewpoint, we can see that it's very dramatic and very different. Notice how the grid is really kind of helping the artist understand those complex foreshortening issues by dividing that compressed shape up or that model into individual shapes that are easier to copy and organize. And that's kind of the basis of the assignment that I gave you last week, where I asked you guys to go ahead and view the Picasso image, but view it upside down and recreate it in your sketchbooks. Again, trying to make this simpler so that the left brain really becomes bored or refuses the task, allowing the right spatially oriented brain to really kind of come forward. But when you look at this, as we looked at this subject, when we look at the previous subject and it's this subject that's reclining, it looks so intimidating. But then when we see this and we see it broken up, I mean, it's pretty easy to draw a little line through that bottom corner of that square, to do an arc that kisses the top of the square here and comes down, a little line there. So by breaking up your subject into more manageable kind of pieces, so to speak. And this is just a very basic kind of illustration of that concept again. So let's talk a little bit further. Now, a first important step when beginning perspective drawing is to find what is called the horizon line or your line of sight. Now, if you were at the beach, this would be where the earth meets the sky if nothing blocks our view, or in this case, the ocean horizon meets the sky. Now, when we try to find our horizon line from our vantage point, whether we're sitting on the ground or sitting in a chair or standing up, the horizon line moves up or down. The horizon line is parallel to your eyes. So if I took a string and drew it out of the center of one of my eyes and took it all the way across the horizon, that string would end up on that horizon. So again, that changes really based off of how you're situating yourselves. Now, in painting and in Renaissance art, we can see a work here by Andrea Mantegna, and we can see that the artist is using perspective devices to create a sense of deep space. Where's the line of sight? What parts of the painting indicate that he understood and employed this kind of perspective? Well, the first thing I'll do is I'll look at this kind of ground plane, and I look at these lines right here as well as these lines right here. And if I take this back, it feels like these lines have a kind of central focus point right about here. I can take this line there. I can even take this line over. So this is our perspective point here. So that means that the artist is constraining all his other lines as far as one point perspective that goes into the distance to this point that is here. And I have some more basic examples, I think, that will help you understand this. Now, let's take a look at this. In this painting by the same artist, Mantegna, we can see that this point of view of the artist is very different from the previous one. This one we called a worm's eye view. It's as if we view everything from below, like we're the size of a worm and they're all giants. This image is site-specific. It's a fresco, and it's part of the Ovitari Chapel in Padua. And you can tell that you're in a lower position because you feel as if the people in the subject tower over you. This also kind of tells the narrative that's being told in this religious piece about St. James being led to execution. Also notice that the perspective here in the arch, notice how that brings that perspective right down here. Those lines come right down to this point. So again, we're very low, made to feel low on that totem when we're looking at this image. And then we have other works like this. Here we have a good example of the ground plane. And again, that ground plane, meaning the checkerboard that you see here, it's that flat horizontal space that extends to that horizon. In linear perspective, the ground plane always appears to tilt up. And this always happens as we go back into the illusion of space. In this painting by Mantegna, you can see that the floor appears to tilt and the tiles diminish and get smaller as they go back in space and converge towards the line of sight. Now, where is that line of sight? If we follow these lines out, ends up being right here. So this is the horizon. Notice if I follow this line up, it ends up here. Notice we see this breakwater jetty, this building. Notice that it ends up right here as well. He's also constraining the height and the scale of the saints that we see on the left and the right-hand side using this point as well, if you can see that. So perspective, again, it's not something that's designed to be intimidating. Again, learning how to draw is probably one of the biggest things that can benefit you because it's going to teach you how to see differently. Now, let's talk about basic perspective. The vanishing point, which we can see here, is centered in the cone of vision. And right now it can be found along the line of sight, or in this case, the horizon line. Now, to make sure the forms all diminish regularly in pictorial space, you got to locate their vanishing point. Now, right now, all objects in this scene have a central vanishing point. Now, when I say that vanishing point, again, imagine a line of string coming out from between your eyes and it's attached at your exact height in the distance. That's where you're kind of finding your vanishing point. And you can see that this really is a very limited one-point perspective. The trees on the right all constrained to this one point in size and scale as they go back. So does the road, so does the pilings or the fence posts on the left-hand side. Where have you seen this in real life? I know that all of you at one point in time have more than likely stood on a set of railroad tracks and looked off in the distance to see those images kind of converge. Very much, again, like this example that you're seeing here. So again, one-point perspective, the parallel lines always appear to converge into the vanishing point. Your objects diminish at relative proportions as they go back into that space. And again, notice how the railroad lines join at a point in the background, and the telephone poles on the left and the right are relatively the same size, but as they go back into space, they consistently get smaller and smaller and smaller. So that's really a basic kind of idea or concept for a one-point perspective. Now, this one right here, this is a one-point perspective as well. It just looks much more elaborate because there's so many more objects in here and the grid on the bottom. So, and you can find these vanishing points by seeing how the crypts as well as the arches on the architectural features all kind of conform to those lines of linear perspectives. Look how they all vanish back to this central point that we see back here in this hallway. Another good example here. Hang on a second, where am I at my notes? Another good example, again, you can see that the stairs, the arched doorways, the beams in the ceiling, all constrained to this one-point perspective happening right here. So this horizon line represents the line of sight for the artist when they drew this. Okay? So you can very convincingly create very believable kind of spaces. All right, let's take a look at this next one. Now here we have Jacopo Tintoretto, and this is his version of the Last Supper, and you can see that he's using a dominant diagonal, primarily the table, to enhance the depth. He's also has used the saints, and look at the saints as they diminish in scale, almost at regular intervals as they go back into the space of the actual painting there. We can also see that happening here. Here, again, we saw a previous work of Hopper's earlier. Hopper is using that kind of idea of that similar kind of dominant diagonal in the seats of this, what I believe is a early New York subway train. Now, if we want to look at two-point perspective, here's how two-point perspective appears. Now, again, we have our horizon line. This represents your line of sight, whether you're sitting, standing, or in a chair. And we can see here that when a block is set at an angle to our visual plane, when we can see two sides in the top, we get what we call a two-point perspective. And again, this is about a 60-40 mix. If it starts to become more of a 70-30, then it actually puts it more towards a one-point perspective. And we'll take a look at that later on this week. Now, two-point perspectives require two vanishing points. Both of these points intersect on that line of sight, meaning the horizon line. The relationship of these points determine how much we see of each face or plane on this cube. So I'm going to ask you guys between now and next time we meet to go ahead and see if you can't find, maybe you have an old box in the garage that you can set up so that you can observe it, so you can draw in the same manner that I'm going to try and show you. Another example that you can see here of linear perspective. This is both one and 2 point. Notice that the trees constrained to 1 point, as does the fence, but then this building constrains to 2 points. We have these lines vanishing to this point on the horizon, as well as these lines vanishing to this point on the horizon there. Now, perspective is not an exclusive invention of Western culture. You know, it was really it was achieved by accumulated discoveries about the depiction of space over many cultures and over many, many centuries. It's not something that just happened instantly. And when you look at stuff like this, we can see that there is slight perspective and scale shown in this Greek terracotta vase when we look at the relationship of the figures in the foreground to the middle ground to the background. Here we can look and see that in this work by Lin Lin, we can see that the artist, he's kind of employing a knowledge of scale, overlap, and some foreshortening in the horses as well. Hang on just a second. I'm getting the spinning beach ball here. There we go. Now, this work by Ma Lin, we can see that there's kind of a complex observation of relative scale. There's some stuff that is diminishing, and although it's really kind of a frontal view, there's a little bit of perspective that we can see in the building here, as well as in the eaves right here. So too little, too much, it's really up to you how you want to present the actual subject. Now, we've seen some of Ando Hiroshige's work before, and when we look at 19th century work like this by Hiroshige, it's kind of a blend of both Eastern and Western styles. And when we look at this, we can see that linear perspective is in use. He has relative scale, overlapping forms, relative distance, there's proportions, the positions of the forms and the people. You can see that as we move back into space, there's a convergence of kind of the market that we see on the left and the right. It's a one-point perspective. And really, it's that kind of drawing everything towards a fixed point of view that falls on that horizon, and understanding these basic laws of perspective are what really kind of make an artist really successful and creative. Now, let's talk about another form of perspective, and that is called aerial perspective. And you've seen this probably many times a week and not even known that's what you were seeing. But you know that when you're on the 101 freeway, maybe you're going north or south and you see the Santa Barbara Mountains or you see the Cuesta grade, one of the two. When you're far away from those mountains or that grade, the mountains do not have a saturated color. In fact, they have this kind of muted color, almost with a little bit of a blue tint. And actually, what is happening is blue, being the shortest wavelength of light, is being broken up as it enters the Earth's atmosphere. And because it's the shortest wavelength of light, it becomes scattered very quickly by both the gases as well as the moisture in our atmosphere. And that kind of reduces perceived color saturation and contrast when you look deeper into an image. And artists use this as a trick to kind of get their audience to see deeper into an image. So this idea of atmospheric or aerial perspective is what I like to call it. Now, when we take a look at this piece right here by Leonardo, it looks like a really beautiful developed piece. And this is a really large canvas. This is about 4.5 foot by 9.5 foot. Very big. I've never had a chance to see it in person, only in textbooks. But what I want to pull you to is a detail of this area right in here. Notice that when I zoom into that area, you can see that it is actually very, very highly detailed. And we can see that we have the rocks here in the background. And as we go further back, the rocks get thinner and lighter, almost as if there's a kind of a fog in the bay here that's causing the light to wash out. So again, this idea of atmospheric perspective is a very important kind of concept. And you can see that here again in this piece, which hopefully you recognize, one of the most famous pieces that came out of the Renaissance period by Leonardo, the Mona Lisa. And you can see again that Leonardo, if you look to the left and right of her portrait, in the background, he's using that blue kind of color cast to emote to that idea of atmospheric haze or perspective. And this was something that was relatively expensive when we think back in the day, because these pigments, were made from rare earth elements. And in fact, blue, which was a very sought after and very expensive pigment to have, because it was made from a stone called lapis lazuli, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's a blue stone that's only harvested in mines in Afghanistan, and it makes up the color that oil painters use, known as ultramarine, which actually means beyond the sea, because they harvested this pigment from beyond the sea in Afghanistan. So kind of interesting stuff, but you can see that happening. So when you see a lot of use of blue in an image from the Renaissance time, that indicates that whoever commissioned that work had a lot of money to pay the artist because the pigments were very, very expensive. You can see here that we have more kind of aerial kind of perspective, almost as if there's kind of like a fog or haze here in the foreground. Here we have Mayong, and his art is really kind of at its best, it's a masterpiece. But it's kind of an understatement of this kind of evocative idea of suggestion. When we look at all this work, his work has typical compositions featuring the extensive use of kind of swirling mist and empty space, with only a few sharply edged forms dramatically silhouetted against the whiteness lent in. This kind of got him the name of this artist called One Corner Ma, because all his compositions were weighted heavy in one corner or the other, and then the upper corner eventually kind of washed out. Very nice way to balance a composition as well as kind of creating depth. Here we can see more of that kind of idea, atmospheric perspective as the fence goes in the background. This kind of reminds me of going to Grand, going down to the beach there at the end of the beach and looking at the fences that are there during the winter and how it blows all the sand up against. Here's some more work. This is by Joseph Turner. We'll look at more of his work this year. This is the Roman Colosseum. And notice that he is using both perspective here as well as atmospheric perspective to kind of express the size and the enormity of the Roman Colosseum. Same thing could be happening here, as you notice when we look at the portico of St. Peter. When we look into that background, we can see that he's using that atmospheric haze idea, or that idea of the subjects becoming light, like they're washed out in light. We can see that here in Joseph Turner's work. He's a classic artist from the mid to late 1800s, and his work is very endemic of these watercolors, and he uses a lot of atmospheric perspective in his work. Again, more of his work, very dramatic. And we see this kind of stuff when you and I go to the beach at Pismo. We see the pier late in the afternoon, and it casts these long shadows, similar kind of ideas. Here we have a piece that is really kind of a metaphorical piece. And this is kind of an imagined recreation of a burial off of the port of Gibraltar. And it's actually one of Turner's friends, and actually a rival painter, a Scottish painter named Sir David Wilkie. And the painting kind of looks radically pared back at first. We see these high cirrus clouds in the evening sky. We see the silhouette of these two ships. One painted a deep black, and it's kind of obscuring the other. And then we've got this kind of, this placid kind of reflective sea. But if you look closer, a lot more starts to emerge. There's a bird in the foreground taking off. The moon is kind of creating this burst of gaseous kind of light through the clouds. And then also we can see there's like a smaller craft off to the right, and then to the left in the distance, the port of Gibraltar, we see a flare going off. And then obviously there's a lantern that's kind of poignantly hanging between the two ships, and it irradiates that kind of smoky atmosphere between the two ships. All the meanwhile, this burial taking place. And again, this was kind of a fictionalized kind of burial. Kind of did it despite his rival artist, just to get his goat, more or less. Now, here we have Caspar David Friedrich. You may or may not have heard of him, but this is a classic example of a guy that was basically forgotten in his homeland. And it wasn't until after his death, I think he died around mid-1840s, and it wasn't until after his death that his artwork was acknowledged. It never got acknowledged during his lifetime. And when you look at his work, it really complied with this kind of romantic aesthetic of the time. And while the close study of landscape and the emphasis of the spiritual elements of nature were commonplace in contemporary artwork, it really feels like Caspar Friedrich really kind of took it to this personal kind of level. And so only probably at the turn of the century was Friedrich really rediscovered by a Norwegian historian, and he actually had one of his first exhibitions in London in 1972, well over 100 years after his death. And so it just kind of adds more kind of sting to that wound that artists are never appreciated in their time. Now, when we look at, and this is more of Frederick's work, when we look at his work, the key to understanding his work is kind of his link between the landscape and religion. And that's what a lot of early work was. Remember that early artwork, a lot of it, 90% of it, was commissioned by the Catholic Church or a well-to-do burgess class. Okay, but remember, we're talking like 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. Here we are now in the 1800s. And we have an artist kind of like Frederick who's overlooked in his own time. And you look at his work, and his landscapes are not just for blissful enjoyment or a beautiful view, but it's also kind of recognizing this instant of sublimity. And it's kind of this reunion of the spiritual self, kind of when you go out and you go on a hike by yourself. And it's about that idea of lonely contemplation by being overwhelmed by nature. And Frederick said that the painter within should not only paint what he sees in front of him, but he should also see what he sees, paint inside what he sees in himself. So if he has nothing within, then he should stop painting what is in front of him. And his work was endemic of colossal skies, storms, mist, ruins, scattered tracts of life, ancient altars, wrecked ships. All this stuff bearing crosses to the presence of God are frequent elements in Frederick's landscapes. Now here we have, let's go back to Kelly McLean. I was showing you some of McLean's work earlier, and much like Caspar David Friedrich, California artist McLean is kind of doing a similar thing. McLean is creating these large-scale drawings that express a kind of different sublime. And it's that sublime excess of American culture, whether that be music, whether that be fast food, whether that be movies, whatever it is. There's something always that's an excess in our life. So here we can see that McLean's abiding theme is kind of this disturbance of nature by odd cultural manifestations. And a lot of the work becomes these kind of pumped up single frame narratives, and we have these kind of surreal details that are countered with this very kind of washed palette and seemingly vast expanses of land and sky. If you're a Bryan Cranston fan like I was and you saw Breaking Bad, this is very endemic of that kind of scene. We look down here. It's like this field out in the middle of nowhere, multiple chain link fences, a ditch, and we see some fires off in the distance. Bad day for Meth Lab 3 and number 4. Why? Because they explode. Let's see what else we got here. More of McLean's work. And when we look at this work, it's this is kind of another kind of update on kind of I don't know. When I look at this, it's kind of like being on the world's scariest roller coaster. And when you look at this, it's really largely devoid of human presence. And it's very subtle, and it has this kind of poetic strangeness that artists like our movie guys like David Lynch, Stephen King, or Gregory Crutzen might envy. When you look at this, the world's longest roller coaster, look at all the atmospheric haze, the perspective, look at the rays of light that are coming down through. It's a very beautiful and engaging image. Here also, we see that McLean also creates these kind of finely tuned pencil drawings of really off-kilter kind of middle American scenes. Here we have these birch trees. We have the profile of a horse down in the upper right. Up here we have a horse, and it looks like it's been kind of impaled. And then we have the evisceration. It looks like those might be intestines. It's like, what am I looking at here? This is on any given day what the artist might create. It's almost like a surreal dream. And when we look at McLean's work, the work is really about how indifferent the world is. The landscape of the world is going to engulf you in all intrusions. And as McLean's kind of pointing out in the paintings and forthrightly states in interviews, nature doesn't care. Okay? Nature will always continue to move on. So when you look at this image and it's titled Good Thing About Maggots. Well, good thing about maggots is that, they go ahead and they decompose and eat, and basically things under the ground, they get rid of them. okay, and turn them into basically back into minerals and excrement and all that kind of stuff. So you can see that McLean's work is very kind of surreal. It takes a lot of different jaunts in many different ways. And here you can see this is it's just kind of unlike McLean's other work. And here we're seeing kind of linear and aerial perspective to kind of give that sense of pictorial kind of realism. And again, it's almost also it's very imaginary, very kind of surreal kind of landscape. Same thing here. We look at McLean's work. Notice that McLean is using both aerial perspective or atmospheric perspective. She's also using 2-point, 1-point perspective. When you look at this work, where would you find, examples of perspective like this? This looks like something I would see in a basin reservoir with slime and trash. What do you think that McLean is saying about our global environment? So oftentimes, obviously, art is very metaphoric, okay? And that's what this work all is about. McLean's work is really about kind of catching you off guard and really making you kind of consider, would you go on this rickety roller coaster? It's like the longest roller coaster in the world, operated by no one. I see smoke in the background in the distance, and this thing doesn't look like it could hold up a wheelbarrow, let alone a roller coaster. So artists kind of seek different ways to kind of engage with their artists with metaphorical ideas, but also using processes like atmospheric perspective, linear perspective, both 1 and 2-point perspective. So when we start, I'm going to do this demo for this next assignment on, see, that would be Tuesday, so it would be Thursdays when I'd see you again. I would ask you guys to go ahead and find a ruler, or at the very least a straight edge, but a ruler will help you best, because I'm going to go ahead and talk about 1 and 2-point perspective and demo this for you. And I'm going to ask you guys to recreate this as well in your sketchbooks. And you're going to want to set something up similar to what I'll be doing. So we'll look more about that on Thursday. Let me go and end right there. Let me stop the recording and give me just one moment, please. And we'll save